Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, COVID-19 CARES Act, Supporting Federal Contractors, a guide for the small business defense industrial base. During this afternoon's presentation, please feel free to submit questions to the presenters using the GoToWebinar control panel. Our presenters will answer as many questions as they can at the end of the webinar, time permitting. Also, a copy of this presentation will be made available this afternoon on the webinar event page and on Butzel Long's Coronavirus Resource Center on butzel.com. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to introduce our panelists. Beth Cryderman Moss from PTAC, Michigan, Justin Klimko and Beth Gotthelf from Butzel Long, and Kyle Cecina from Chemical Bank, a division of TCF Bank. Beth?
Thank you, Jonathan. Welcome everybody this afternoon, what we formerly would know as Tax Day. So I want to thank all the participants that are out there and say hello to all of our colleagues and friends from around the state. Just to let you know, we have a smattering of small businesses located from all around the state of Michigan. We have some representation from MEDC, a couple of large primes out there. So we're looking forward to an informational session. So this is what our agenda is going to look like for today. And I'm going to do just a brief introduction to start out there for all of our participants so that you know exactly the type of expertise they have and some of where they're coming from as they provide their information. So I am Beth Cryderman Moss. Again, welcome and good afternoon. I'm the director of the Macomb Regional PTAC and president of the PTACs of Michigan. This is the second webinar that the PTACs of Michigan have presented since the great COVID meltdown on our stay-at-home work order. And I hope all of you are doing well out there. To give you a little bit of my background, I have been in small business counseling and consulting for a little bit over 20 years. I have a master's certification in government contracting from George Washington University. I am a certified federal contracts manager through the Contract Management, National Contract Management Association, NCMA. I've also served as a past president for the Michigan chapter of the National Defense Industrial Association, NDIA. And I'm a past advisor for the Michigan chapter of Women in Defense, and you'll hear that WID, Women in Defense, a couple of times throughout these introductions. I'm going to go through, as I said, we're going to do a run through of each of our panelists, and then after I'm done talking, I'm going to pass it over to Justin Klimko to tell you a little bit about Mr. Klimko. He practices law out of Butzel Long's Detroit office. He is actually the president of the firm and serves on its board. He graduated from Duke University Law School and Ohio University. We won't hold that against him here in Michigan. He has an extensive background and experience in securities regulation, corporate financing, mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, and general corporate matters. Mr. Klimko has taught corporate law for 5 years as an adjunct professor at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. So some of you legal beagles may have come across him as a professor. He's also a past chair of the State Bar of Michigan Business Law Section. After Mr. Klimko, we will have Kyle Cecina. Kyle is a first vice president for Chemical Bank. Her responsibilities cover a broad range of commercial banking, particularly lending. Kyle joined Chemical Bank in 2017 and has over 16 years of experience. She has a proficiency in aerospace and defense, export financing, and medical lending. Kyle holds a degree from Oakland University with a Bachelor of Science in Finance. She is a trustee for the HFHS Foundation of Trustees and on the Board of Visitors for Oakland University School of Nursing. She has a membership with ACG, NDIA, and Women in Defense. Kyle has received the Cranes 40 Under 40 Award in 2015 for her work in launching a new export lending program. Kyle is also a native in the Michigan chapter, also active in the Michigan chapter of WID. And then finally, Beth Gothelf, my dear old friend, who also identifies with Butzel Long's Bloomfield Hills office, as we all work from home. She is the firm's director of innovation and external relations. And for those of you who know Beth personally, that makes sense that she's very active in external relations for her firm. She's a co-chair of the Energy and Sustainability Practice and the chair of the Aerospace and Defense Industry Team. Beth counsels clients in government contracting, ITAR, EAR, and foreign military sales, and has been instrumental in connecting Michigan and Israel companies. She also works with startup companies for the Macomb OU Incubator. She's a leader in environmental law, bringing creative solutions to remediation, redevelopment, tax incentives, and waste management, and is also an advisor for the Michigan chapter of Women in Defense. So thank you to all of our panelists here today in putting this together. So I wanted to, whoops, how did I do that? I thought I had this down. Sorry, folks. So just real quickly, before we get started too far, I wanted to implore you to use all the resources available to you through all of the great resources that we have here in Michigan. I lost my control again here. Thank you. That's where we should be. So yeah, there's many resources available to our state of Michigan businesses out there, and we have been, I know, inundated with tons of information available to us, and we hope to break that down for you today. I wanted to give our SBA office and our local SBDCs here in the state of Michigan a shout out as we're facing this unprecedented economic disruption due to coronavirus 19. This all started through the CARES Act, which was signed on March 27th by the president, giving relief to $376 billion in a relief to American businesses. This has kept our SBA and SBDC organizations very busy. So when you do get these charts, these are some of the organizations that give some specific guidance if you're active in GSA contracting. The Acquisition Policy Library through GSA gives a great overview of letters and class deviations specific to GSA issues through their senior procurement executive. It's maintained and updated regularly. Same with the Defense Logistics Agency. For those of you not familiar, DLA provides about 86% of all military spares for and nearly 100% of fuel. They manage all the reutilization for military equipment out of DLA, also a plethora of information out on their website. I find personally the Defense Pricing and Contract organization out of the Department of Defense, the DPC, they're responsible for all the pricing, contracting, and executive procurement policy. So as changes come to us related to that, check their website. And then our MEDC office here in the state of Michigan has a great source of information that is specific to Michigan companies. There's information out on their website related to COVID-19 relief grants, relief initiatives, loan programs, getting involved on a local level through PMBC, their Pure Michigan Business Connect. So I encourage you all to visit all of those different websites. And of course, your PTACs of Michigan, we have, this has been rapidly evolving. We've tried to break it down for you through what we call our COVID-19 response playbook. This is updated on a weekly basis, if not more often, posted out on our website. You can follow this link to get to that playbook. And it's very specific to different executive and legislative actions impacting contract authority and issuance. So feel free to tap into that. Okay, I'm going to try to make an attempt here to move the screen forward again, but there we go. Okay. So this next chart, I wanted to kind of break down just a little bit on some of our kind of frequently asked questions that I have been getting pursuant to COVID-19 as it relates to contracting. One of the things that that we get, and I sort of just picked out our top 5 here. How do I know if I'm an essential critical infrastructure? So contractor personnel performing under, if you have a contract currently that's DX or DO rated, you are considered essential critical infrastructure and workforce. So in addition to that, it might be helpful for you to know that all senior procurement executive personnel, associated heads of contracting activities, program executive officers, and unit commanders at the 06 civilian level and equivalent and above are all considered essential critical infrastructure to determine contract work functions. And it also may be helpful for you to know that that the PTACs of Michigan are considered essential critical infrastructure during this time. So we are all through the state, all through our state, all through the nation, the PTACs of Michigan, or PTACs, are critical infrastructure. So you should be able to contact us through, if you're on a national scale outside of the state of Michigan, through the aptac-us.org website or the PTACs of Michigan website. We are all here, all present and accounted for. Another question that we often get is if I'm not considered critical essential infrastructure, do I need to comply with local state in place orders? And of course, you should follow your local governance and guidance if you're not considered critical essential infrastructure. If you don't have remote capability, contracting officers have been encouraged to maximize all flexibility to the fullest extent possible by allowing telework. So you are allowed to work from home, even if you're not critical, or even if you're critical and essential telework. If you are able to move your operations offsite, you are encouraged to do so, and your contracting officer should be making some type of either modification to your contract if that's not already done. Under new guidance, under the CARES Act, if you are not able to work to telework, then in some instances, and I use the word, in contracting, there's 2 key words, the may word, may consider sick leave as an allowable expense, depending on funds available under your contract. So the big difference between may and shall, as we know, it shall be done, and may, it will be taken under consideration to allow sick leave as an allowable expense. Also, just to let you know that they have increased the progress payment threshold. So that's up to $95,000 for small business concerns for progress payments. And then DCMA and DFAS are working together and have issued guidance to accelerate payments to small businesses. So this is kind of the top 5 questions that we've gotten in our office related to specific contract actions. If you need any further guidance on this or any other types of questions related to this, of course, don't hesitate to contact your PTAC office. And also, I wanted to leave you with a couple of opportunities that seem to be very, very important to our national defense, national security as it relates to COVID-19. DLA has issued an open solicitation accepting white papers to provide PPE, personal protection equipment, N95 masks or equivalent. So if you have the capability and feel that you're in a position that you could possibly manufacture or contribute to that cause, they're accepting white papers through this email website until May 4th. And then the Undersecretary of Defense Ellen Lord established a joint acquisition task force to also help on a national scale synchronize acquisition and execution of the DoD COVID-19 response medical resources. So feel free to visit those sites as well. And then lastly, I want to just be able to kind of, we're sort of, you know, we've all heard this, looking at our news, looking at the information, we're all in this together. I like to, I have a kind of a saying sort of that I've developed in my mind, is that we need to acknowledge where we are, what these times are bringing to us. And in that acknowledgement, we can then focus on finding the silver lining. And I think that's important for all of us to do, both personally to maintain our family units and also in our business structure. So we need to stay calm and carry on and do all that we can do in each of our own capacities to support our small businesses, even to the degree where that means trying to hit carry out if you can to keep those restaurants going. We need to try to keep our small business infrastructure in place to the greatest degree possible. Just before all this happened, I think in January of 2019, the Small Business Administration put out that small businesses, they estimate, are responsible for about 44% of our US economy. So we are looking at doing everything we can here at the PTAC, doing our part. So hopefully you're doing yours, and we'll get through this together out on the other end of this, hopefully sooner rather than later. So before I pass this, well, I got some feedback. And to take over, I want to take the opportunity to thank Butzel Long and Kyle. Jonathan, you've been a great support. So I think that you'll find this information very helpful. And moving forward, let's see what we can do to keep this thing moving. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm going to take over now. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Justin Klimko from Butzel Long. I'm going to talk about the CARES Act, particularly the Paycheck Protection Program. So this first slide just shows you the scope of the CARES Act, $2 trillion, not only the largest economic relief package in the country's history, but really in the world's history. The middle line in green shows you the size of the small business assistance. Of that 377 billion, 349 billion was originally designated for paycheck protection loans. The Democrats and Republicans in Washington have been talking about adding another 250 billion to that amount, which appears timely, although they have not been yet able to agree on the details. And the reason I say that appears timely is because the Wall Street Journal is running an article today saying that by the end of the day, they expect the entire original 349 billion to be committed. And this only started taking applications 12 days ago. So it's the demand has been extremely high for this, but we're pretty confident there's going to be a lot more added, another 250 billion at least added to this program. So in talking about the PPP program, I want to discuss who's eligible for a loan, what the loan can be used for, when forgiveness is available, what happens to the any part of a loan that does not get forgiven, and how you go through the process, although Kyle actually will spend more time talking about the process. So eligibility is the first standard. Who is eligible to get a PPP loan? So first of all, if you already meet the SBA small business concern standards, then you are eligible to get a PPP loan. Now, those standards are industry by industry based on NAICS codes. Everyone's got a North American Industrial Classification Code, and you'll find that on your tax return, as a matter of fact. The SBA has classified businesses according to those codes in determining which is a small business concern, but mainly those classifications are based on revenues, although some are based on size. But in addition to regular SBA small business concerns, the CARES Act says that any business, including veterans organizations and some nonprofits as well, may get a CARES Act loan or qualify for one if they have 500 employees or fewer, or if greater, the number of employees permitted under the SBA standards for that NAICS code. And there are a number of NAICS codes under the SBA rules for which the number of employees to still remain as a small business concern is greater than 500. So you get the greater of those two numbers, 500 or the NAICS number associated with your code. You can find those codes online at sba.gov in the table of small business size standards. Now, in addition to businesses, sole proprietorships, and independent contractors may also apply separately. But to be eligible, the organization asking for the loan must have been in operation on February 15th of this year, and you're going to hear that date in several other slides. But the thrust of this act is that it's not created to finance new business. It's created to maintain existing business. So you must have been in operation on February 15th. You can't form a new business and expect to get a PPP loan. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're counting whether you qualify is the affiliation rules in the SBA rule playbook. If you have an affiliate, and the most common affiliation is someone having a parent company, but it includes brothers and sister corporations, it includes subsidiaries, they will be lumped together. All of their employees will be lumped together in determining whether or not you qualify under the size standards. So if you have a parent company, foreign or domestic, you are going to have to lump your employees together with that parent company and all the other controlled companies in determining whether you qualify. That's the way the rules in the CARES Act exist right now. There are a couple of exceptions, probably not very relevant to the participants in this call. You can see hospitality type businesses. There's an exception that allows them to apply separately, franchise businesses, et cetera. But the affiliation rule is a catch that may prevent businesses that think they're otherwise qualified from getting a PPP loan. What size of a loan can you get? The maximum loan under the Act for any individual borrower is $10 million, and no borrower can get more than one loan. But the actual amount of the loan is calculated by taking your average total monthly payroll costs over the previous year and multiplying them by 2.5. So 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs, that's essentially 2.5 months of your payroll costs. And 2.5 months is 10 weeks essentially, and I want you to remember that 10 weeks because it's going to come up in another slide. What are eligible payroll costs? The left side of this slide shows them. Compensation of all sorts is included. Payment for leave is included. Severance payments, health care, including insurance premiums, and certain state or local taxes assessed on employee comp like unemployment insurance premiums. What is not included? You may not include the portion of any employee's compensation that exceeds an annual rate of $100,000 a year. So if you have employees that are making more than $100,000 a year, in determining how much of that pay will qualify for calculation of your CARES Act loan, you can only include the $100,000. So what you really do is you take all of the pay from the previous year, you subtract out anything over 100K for any individual, you then divide it by 12 and multiply it by 2.5. You may not include the comp of employees whose principal place of residence is outside of the US. Here in Michigan, especially here in Southeast Michigan, there are employers who have Canadian employees, so this can be relevant. You've got to back the Canadian employees out. You also, although generally you're entitled to include leave amounts, if you are using the credit under the other act that was passed a few weeks ago called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and that's the act that allows you, that it provides for additional paid leave, but allows you to get a credit against employment taxes, payroll taxes. If you're using that credit, you have to back that out of your calculation for the CARES Act. That's simply a way of saying you can't double dip in getting money from the government. What may you use the loan for? Payroll costs. Now remember, payroll costs go into calculating the amount, but you can use the loan for more than simply payroll costs. You You can also use it to pay interest on mortgage obligation, not the principal amount, but interest on mortgage obligations, rent, utilities, and interest on other debt obligations that are incurred before February 15th. So again, you can't get new obligations financed by this. So the availability of a loan is good news, and there's also some additional good news, and that is you may be entitled, if you have a loan, to have part or all of that loan forgiven. This is the free money aspect of the CARES Act, meaning that you would not have to repay the loan. So in calculating forgiveness, you are allowed to include, first thing you have to do is look at the 8-week period following the date on which you received the loan proceeds. During that 8 weeks, payroll costs, again, interest on mortgages, rent, and utility payments can be included in calculating your forgiveness amount. But there's a couple of caveats here. One is that the payroll cost portion has to be at least 75%, or said differently, the last 3 items in that category, that list, can only be 25%, not more than 25% of the forgiveness amount. The second caveat is note that there are time limitations here. If you look, remember the previous slide where we said you can use the loan for any of these things, including interest, rent, utilities. For forgiveness purposes, you may only include forgiveness on obligations that existed before February 15th of this year. The government is essentially saying we will help you borrow to finance costs no matter when incurred, but we're only going to forgive you the costs that were in existence before we started down this road. Okay, now remember that the purpose of the payroll protection program is to keep people employed and to support their pay, and that therefore there are certain things that an employer might do that will limit or reduce the amount of the loan that can be forgiven. One of those things is a reduction in workforce. In order to calculate the amount of the reduction, you have to create a fraction. The fraction is, the numerator of the fraction is the average monthly number of full-time equivalent employees during that 8-week period after you get the loan. The denominator is the average monthly full-time employees for one of 2 earlier periods. And you as the borrower can choose which of those 2 periods you want to use. The first period is February 15th to June 30th of last year, 2019. The second period is the first 2 months of this year. You're going to want to pick the period that has the fewest number of FTEs. And let's use an example. Now, bear in mind, this is a pro rata reduction. You're going to multiply that fraction by the forgiveness amount. So let's suppose that in the 8-week period, you as an employer have 75 FTEs. Let's suppose in that first period, February 15th to June 30th of last year, you have 100 employees. Your fraction is therefore 75 over 100, or 75%, which means the amount that you would otherwise be entitled to forgiveness is going to be limited to 75%. If you had $1 million that would otherwise be entitled to forgiveness, you will only get forgiveness for $750,000. Let's suppose you look at the first 2 months of this year and determine that in those 2 months you had 75 employees. Your fraction is now 75 over 75, or 100%, and there would be no limit on the amount of forgiveness. So you're going to want to use the earlier period with the fewest number of FTEs. The second thing that an employer might do that will reduce the amount of forgiveness is to reduce salary or wages. What the Act says is reducing salary or wages by more than 25% during the 8-week period. There's some questions around this, and bear in mind with the CARES Act, I made this comment before, but it's a 335-page single-spaced act, and it appears to have been drafted by a congressional staffer on the one morning while riding the subway to work. It's got a lot of anomalies and inconsistencies in it, and there's a fair amount of just, what does that mean? But in any event, this is a dollar-for-dollar reduction. Unlike the previous reduction that was a pro rata reduction, this is a dollar-for-dollar reduction, and you look at employee by employee. But it only applies to employees making not more than $100,000 annually. And it's even more quirky than that, because what the Act says, it applies to any employee, the reduction in compensation of any employee who did not receive for any single pay period in 2019 wages or salary at a rate in excess of $100,000. So let's assume you had an employee who was making $1,000 a week, $52,000 a year, and let's assume that you are paying that person semi-monthly, twice a month. You're paying that person $2,000 in each pay period. But let's now say you gave that person a $2,000 bonus at year end. In that last pay period, that person would have received both their $2,000 regular salary for those 2 weeks, and also that additional $2,000. That's $4,000 multiplied by 26. Voila, that person's rate is $104,000. That does not seem to be consistent with the spirit of this act, but that's what the words say. The other problem with this is determining what the starting point for determining the reduction is. It says a reduction during the 8-week period, and it says not more than 25%. Well, 25% of what? That question is answered. It's 25% of the previous quarter. But when do you measure the reduction? If you were to impose reductions in pay immediately before getting the loan, then that's not during the 8-week period. So the question is whether there would be any penalty arising out of that. We're looking for more clarification on that. Now, you may say to yourself, well, I'm already in trouble because I've laid people off or I've cut pay. Therefore, I'll never get full forgiveness. And that's not entirely true. The CARES Act says that if you made staff reductions between February 15th and April 26th of this year, or you make compensation reductions, those won't count against your forgiveness if you eliminate the reduction by June 30. And the significance of April 26th is simply that it's 30 days after the act was adopted. Okay, so that might look like a big loophole to you. You might say, well, gee, I can lay off all my employees before April 26th, then get my loan, then bring them all back on June 29th, and I'll get I get the full benefit of the loan and no reduction of my forgiveness. Technically, that's true, but it's too clever by half, because remember that all we're talking about now is a reduction in forgiveness. The starting point for forgiveness are the 4 categories we talked about, and 75% of that number has to be payroll costs. So if you've laid off all your employees and you're not paying them during this period, you're not going to have the payroll costs that go into the forgiveness formula in the first place. So it's not the loophole that it appears to be. If the loan is not forgiven, then it continues as a loan or any portion of it. The CARES Act provided some parameters. The SBA has come down within those parameters and said, here's what the case will be. So the CARES Act says not more than 10-year term. The SBA says 2-year term. CARES Act says interest at not more than 4%. The SBA says 1%. Principal and interest will be deferred on that loan for at least 6 months and up to 1 year. I want to point out a couple issues to note about this whole loan and loan forgiveness, especially the loan forgiveness. The first thing is you may say to yourself, well, look, I am going to go get a loan. I'm going to keep my payroll the same. I'm going to keep my workforce the same. So I'll easily be able to offset the entire amount and get forgiveness for the entire amount because I'm not going to change any pay costs. That's not entirely true because remember, you're comparing apples and oranges here. The loan amount is the 10 weeks we talked about earlier. You base the loan amount on that 10 weeks. However, your measuring period for qualifying expenses is only 8 weeks. So even if you keep your payroll costs the same, you're comparing an 8-week cost with a 10-week cost, and there will be a gap likely. You can soak up some of that gap with your rent and utilities, but remember, that can't be more than 25% of total forgiveness. So there may be an issue in terms of getting full forgiveness. Another thing I want to point out is there's this funny language in the Act about taxes. If you look at the definition of payroll costs, it says payroll cost does not include FICA and income tax withheld during the period from February 15th to June 30th. And everyone has looked at that language and says, what does that mean? Some commentators have suggested that what it means is that you can only get forgiveness for the net amounts you pay the employees, not for the gross amounts. Now, fortunately, the SBA's frequently asked questions that was issued originally on April 7th and has been updated since then appears to say, no, that's not true. You don't take out the employee portion of the taxes. You can't include employer portions, and I'll talk about something else with that in a minute, but you can include the employee portion. We're hoping to get a little bit more clarification on that. I'm sure Kyle will tell you that they need that at the bank because ultimately the bank is going to have to make judgments on forgiveness applications. So the next two slides will talk about process, and I'm not going to spend much time on this because it's really Kyle's bailiwick too. Process for getting a loan, the main point is get with a bank quick. As I say, the original tranche of money appears to be being exhausted even as we speak. There's more coming, we think, but don't delay if you want one of these. The process for getting forgiveness. Well, now it's decided to slow for a second. Okay, here we go. Again, you're going to provide documentation to your bank. The third bullet point on this slide is important. Normally, if you have debt and the debt is forgiven, you have to recognize taxable income. It's considered the same thing as if someone gave you money, which of course would be taxable, and you use that money to pay off the loan. The CARES Act specifically says that forgiven amounts will not constitute cancellation of debt income. You do not have to include them in gross income. I'm going to move on just a second. There are provisions for businesses too large to apply for a PPP loan. There are some loan provisions. They have a lot of strings attached to them. There are certain things you have to agree not to do if you're publicly held, especially things like no dividends or repurchases. There are limitations on compensation for executives. So this is much more restrictive than the PPP program. One more thing, and I really want to focus on the second bullet point on this slide. The CARES Act also provides for a deferral of your FICA payroll deposits. Through the end of 2020, you may defer paying that money and you don't have to pay it until half of it in 2021 and half of it in 2022. And that could be valuable. The FICA portion, the employer portion of FICA, you may defer depositing those taxes. Now, deferral is not available to any PPP loan participant whose indebtedness is forgiven, but you may defer up to the time of forgiveness. And if you get forgiveness, the amount that you deferred up to that point still does not have to be paid until these two subsequent periods, December 31, 21 and 22. So that could be a valuable additional benefit, and you don't have to qualify. You don't have to be a PPP eligible business in order to get this deferral. This is just a slide showing our team at Butzel, our CARES Act team. We've got a lot of people because there's a lot of different aspects to this. I think we're ready to move on and move to Kyle. So Kyle, do you want to take control of the slides?
Sure, thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. Sorry guys, I think it's acting up. Oh, there we go. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Kyle with TCF Bank. TCF is the largest bank based in Michigan, and we are dedicated to providing top-notch customer service, especially during this time. We've heavily invested in the PPP program. It's all hands on deck, and we hope that helps ease the hardship impact on your business and employees during this difficult time. We've already touched on a lot of this. I'll just give a quick broad overview. We've got a maximum, oh, shoot, sorry guys. We have a maximum loan amount of 2.5 times your monthly payroll, a 2-year term on these loans, 1% interest rates, payments deferred for 6 months, and then it's a principal and interest amortized over 18 months after that. As he touched on earlier, that's different from what we initially thought and what we initially communicated to our customers. We went based off the CARES Act, and the SBA has provided interim guidance since then that's changed it. Just a special item of note is we still have not received the final SOP, which is a standard operating procedure from the SBA on this. So we're working based on our history, our interpretation of the CARES Act, and then our interpretation of the guidance that we've received thus far from the SBA. Remember, businesses with less than 500 employees per location, self-employed and independent contractors can apply. Eligible proceeds are 2 months worth of payroll costs, including salaries of wages. You can also use the funds for interest on mortgage applications and rent and utilities. It's 4 easy steps. Step 1 is to, oh, sorry guys. Okay, well that's not working. Can anybody go backwards for me? Oh, here we go. Sorry guys. 4 easy steps. Go to contact your bank. So I would talk to your bank representative, the RM, your branch manager, whoever you normally have contact with on the bank. Step 2 is going to be to gather all the information you're going to need. That's when you really want to talk to your attorneys and your CPAs, like we just mentioned in the slide before. Step 3 is going to be go to your bank's application. It's probably going to be an online document, and log in and apply. It should take less than 20 minutes. I don't know of any banks that don't have an online application, but you can always download the application online from the Treasury site or the SBA to pre-fill it, so you know what to do. And step 4 is please be patient as we wait to get you your money. And I'll touch a little more detail on these things in a moment. Okay, so things that you'd like for to document, and I'll note that we have received interim guidance from the SBA, but each bank has a different process and different documentation that they may require. These are some of the application documents that we think are helpful for you to gather, but please talk to your banker and find out specifically what they require, because they can have their own guidelines that could be tighter than the SBA. You're going to want to see 2019 tax documentation to support payroll numbers. I'm getting a lot of 940, 941s. Payroll registers. I know a lot of companies, like ADP in particular, have done a great job providing reports to you where you can just upload that report to the website, and it really helps you figure out the pay, because remember, it's capped at $100,000 for those higher paid individuals. 1099s for independent contractors. I'm also looked at Schedule Cs for sole proprietors, some documentation showing total group health insurance, some documentation showing the sum of all retirement plans, names, titles, ownership percentages, social security numbers, and driver's license for the owners. One particular thing to note for us that we've had at Chemical or TCF Bank, we've had a lot of customers that were great working with their attorneys and CPAs to put all this together. And the application was filled out properly, and they might have had their controller or CFO or their CPA fill out the application, and they quote unquote signed the application. That's most of this is electronic. That's perfectly acceptable. But if you have your CFO, your controller, your attorney, your CPA, your spouse, or anyone else fill out the application and electronically sign it, you will have to have a copy of their driver's license, social security number, and their address, because you also need to do a clear report on that individual as well. So just in case you had that person fill it out, make sure you have that information ready, as otherwise it could hold up your process. Okay, so advice: work directly with your banker, begin gathering the information needed, and move with urgency. Funds are rapidly running out. I know they were 60% exhausted a couple days ago. Banks are working furiously. Some banks have closed their application. Some banks you can only apply now by reaching out to your relationship manager directly. And I know of a few banks that are still accepting online applications, but please move quickly. We suspect the bucket will be refilled with more money from Congress, but we don't want to bet on that, and we want to get as many people approved as possible. want to talk about a few things. Forgiveness. How is your bank going to calculate that forgiveness within the next 60 days? We are not 100% sure of everything that will be required, as we have not gotten that guidance yet. Our bank, for example, has put together a template of what we think we are going to require from people and how that forgiveness will be calculated, but we're not giving that to our borrowers yet, as we're waiting to make sure there's no more guidance in the next 2 weeks on that. Timing of funding. What a lot of bankers have thought is that people would be able to be approved for this application, and okay, maybe you're a restaurant, you have people laid off, but you're not going to open until May, and they're going to wait, and they're not going to advance on their loans and take the funds until May 1st. That's really not the case. There's been some additional guidance. They've said the timing of the funds has to be within 10 days. From our bank and other bankers that I've spoken to, that timing might be just kind of tight based on the fact that, for us, for example, we have 14,500 applications for the SBA. We normally do a bit over 200 in a year. So getting out that many documents that quickly and making sure they're accurate could pose a challenge. So we expect that there might be some movement in that timing of funding. But it's up, as soon as you have your SBA number, it's the speed in which your bank can get you documents, and then you can get that funding. That funding will be provided directly to you in one lump sum. I do have some clients that are opening a specific account and putting the funds in there and then spending the funds from that account just for easier tracking. It's not a requirement. We're not forcing people to do that, but some people have asked about it. It's entirely fine. I'm hoping that the payroll companies will provide these nice reports for tracking again, but do keep track of your payroll, and please be patient. I mean, at our bank, for example, I know people are working 3 different shifts to get this information into ETRAN, which is the government website, to get the SBA approval number. And people are just going as fast as they can. It's just a really challenging time, but we know your funds are important, that you're facing unprecedented hardships, and we're working the best we can. So contact your relationship manager now if you haven't already. And if you have any questions that you think I can help with, please feel free to let me know. And then I'll turn this over to Beth.
All right. Thank you very much, Kyle. This is Beth Gadhelf, also known as the other Beth, speaking. And I want to thank all of our panelists for all your great presentations. By the way, this will all be on the Butzel website. If you go under there, under coronavirus, and click on that red tab, you get all sorts of information, including the webinar. But give it a couple hours before it's on there. And also the presentation will be on there in addition. And we have had a number of questions coming in. I do want to mention one thing. Kyle had talked about additional funds, and right now the Senate set yesterday the date for when they'll return as May 4th. And unless they have unanimous consent, nothing will happen until May 4th. I'm told by Senator Gary Peters' office, as well as, you've seen some things in the paper, that they do expect to have additional funding. The amount is unknown. It sounds like it will be at least 250 billion. Maybe it will be significantly higher, and include a few more, take care of the hospitals, the municipalities, etc. But you should see it. But going on that, one of the first questions was, how long after we get our approval number, Kyle, will we see the money in our bank account?
Hi, great question. It can be anywhere between 48 hours and 2 weeks. And I know that's frustrating. It's not helpful, but it's really dependent on the volume that your bank has and how fast they can go to get those documents. I know for us that we're taking the electronic signatures on the docs. So as soon as we receive the documents back to you, we'll fund likely the same day, but every bank has a different policy. So I'd contact your relationship manager.
Okay. And then here's a question for Beth, the other Beth. You know, you mentioned that you are part of PTAC Michigan and also PTAC Macomb, and I always get confused because I have a company in Troy, so it's easier for me to use PTAC Macomb, but I'm also often sent to Schoolcraft. And what if I am, me personally, is in Oakland County, but my business is in Macomb County? Which one do I use? How does this work?
Hey, Beth, that's a really good question. Thanks for somebody posting that. You should go to the PTAC where your business is located. And even though during these times when we are on stay-at-home work orders, executive order, you may live in, let's say, Macomb County, and you work in St. Clair County, because that's where your business is located, you should still work with the PTAC in St. Clair County. It should be based on where your office is located, where your business is located, not you physically as a homeowner or citizen, but the county in which your business is located is your local PTAC. Does that clarify?
Yes, thank you. Here's another question. I'm not sure if this is for Justin or Kyle. And they're asking about employees that make more than $10,000 per month for the 2 allowable months. Are they limited in how much they can reimburse them?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Beth, can you repeat that?
Well, the question was if you have an employee making, say, 100,000, and then you can only pay them, you know, just over 8,000 per month for the 2 allowable months in order for their pay to be forgivable. I'm not sure I understand that one either. So maybe we'll move on.
If I had to,
I'm sorry. The limitation is not on how much you can pay them, but just how much you can include in forgiveness. If you're paying somebody more than a rate of $100,000 a year, you can continue to pay them whatever you want to, but you can only include the wages up to the rate of $100,000 a year in your forgiveness amount. So if you had an employee, the $8,333 is essentially per month $100,000. That's all you could include in your loan forgiveness amount. But if you were paying that person actually $12,000 a month, you can pay them that amount. You just can't include the entire thing in determining how much of your loan can be forgiven.
Okay, I think that answers it. The next question is, how do you determine a full-time employee? Is it the number of hours of the payroll divided by 30 to get an average?
Unmuted.
Kyle, I can take that one. We did not get super specific guidance on that. So, and it included part-time and full-time employees. So we took the total number of employees. So let's say you had, 30 people that worked 40 hours and 10 people that worked 15 or 20 hours each. We took 40 people. That's how we calculated it. And then when we look at it later on, we're going to say, okay, how many people out of that 40 did you bring 35 back? Did you bring 38 back? Did you bring back all 40? But they didn't specifically break down how many hours and what constitutes a full-time employee in the SBA SOP.
Okay, thank you. As part of that, we have a lot of employers that use contract employees. So the question is, can we use 1099 contractor payments in calculating our loan amounts? Maybe Justin, you can answer that.
Yeah, the answer is no. You may not use 1099 payments to 1099 contractors or independent contractors or sole proprietors. They can apply for their own loans, but you may not include the amounts that you pay on 1099 individuals in your loan amount. And you also may not include those persons as employees. You don't have to include those persons. Let me put it differently. You don't have to include those persons as employees in determining whether you are under or over 500.
Okay. A related one, there's quite a few questions concerning this 25, how much you can get for employees and only 25% reimbursement for other expenses such as rent, etc. What if our employees is only 70% of our total costs? Then what?
Well,
Then that portion that portion wouldn't be forgiven. It would be part of what's amortized over the 18 months. But the way the question was posed, I'm wondering if they're saying that of their total expenses, only 70% was payroll. That wouldn't impede you at all. They're going off the 2.5 times a month payroll. So as long as all the payroll that you had was eligible, i.e. 100,000 or under, in theory, you'd be able to forgive that entire loan amount if you kept your payroll the same.
Okay, the next question I am going to first direct to Justin to see if you know the answer. Per some news reports, fintech companies have been approved by the SBA to make PPP loans. Where can I find the names of those companies?
Unmuted.
So I'm not aware of a particular source or repository of names. This is kind of happening in real time as we go. They still have to apply to the SBA to be included in the program, and that's happening, sort of day by day. And they are sort of promoting themselves for doing that. But there are a lot of non-traditional lenders who are trying to get involved in this. Beth, let me also just add a caveat to the last question. If the question was if our payroll is only 70% of our total loan amount, that doesn't impair your ability to use your payroll. But what it does mean is you can only, your total forgiveness amount can only consist of 25% of things that are not payroll. So if you had, let's use a simple example. You had $1 million loan, you had a payroll of $700,000. You could include the entire $700,000 in your loan amount, assuming it's all qualified pay under 100K. But for the rest of your forgiveness amount, rent, utilities, mortgage interest, that amount could not be more than 25% of the total. So in that instance, you're probably not going to get forgiveness of the entire loan. There's going to be a portion that will not be forgiven and that will still be a loan. That doesn't mean you can't use all of the compensation in the forgiveness, but it may mean that you won't get to 100% in determining the amount of forgiveness against the amount of the loan.
Hey,
Okay,
Beth, it's Kyle.
go.
I want to touch on that question just a little bit more. On the SBA website, there's usually a button where you can find a lender near you. And on NAGL, it's a national association for banks and other SBA lenders. They also have a button on their page to find an SBA lender. So that will probably help people if they're looking for someone and they can't use their current bank or relationship manager.
Okay, on that, Kyle, here's another quick question for you. You mentioned that you're waiting for the SOP. When do you think that you will get the SOP? And if you want to expand on what you expect the SOP to say, that would be helpful. Just the guidelines of it.
I don't know when we're going to get it. We haven't had any communication on that. And I'm hoping that it will have some more clarity on the actual documentation required for the forgiveness portion. In addition, we're also hoping that we may receive an SBA note at this time, or a note. At this time, we're using the bank's notes. And then typically we use an SBA note in the document. So those are two things I know in particular the banks are waiting and looking for.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question for Beth. Actually, I have another question for Beth. And because this is a number of defense companies and most of you are under 500 employees, but I do have a couple of you that are over 500 that's on the phone. The question is, my company has been deemed as an essential critical infrastructure by the DoD. Can we accept other non-DoD contract work during this time? And I know that me personally, I have received a number of these questions on that. And so Betsy, I'll let you take it.
Thanks, Beth. Yes, we have gotten several of those as well. And yes, if you are a DXDO through the DPAS, Defense Priorities and Allocation System, if you are performing on a DX or DO rated contract, you have to prioritize those contracts over all others. However, if you have enough capacity and capability to perform other work, as long as it doesn't impede the prioritization of those contracts, you can take on other work.
Okay, I would just add to that, there are some in the state of Michigan, which is different than other states, but some in the government in Michigan that will say only essential parts. You can only work on essential parts. So for that excess capacity, the example was if you're also doing work for a Corvette, which they believe is non-essential, then you should stop that line and just work on other types of essential work. We've gotten letters from Ford, GM, and some of the others that believe automotive is critical and therefore have argued that you can continue to work on those. So that one's a little bit complicated. For those of you in that situation, strongly suggest that you reach out to the two Beths to help you work through that, that answer. And one more for Beth.
Oh, wait, can I add on that just a little, Beth, before you move forward?
Go,
Beth?
Kyle.
Oh, thanks. I just want to let you know, for some of our DoD customers, in order to comply with DoD, for example, some of my clients have had to have additional inventory on hand and things like that. And I know our banks and other banks are working actively to modify formulas when appropriate on a short-term basis to potentially allow for some more inventory or things that we wouldn't normally do in order for them to comply with those contracts. So if that's something that's affecting you, I know we are making modifications. I've increased some lines. I've adjusted some formulas and things like that to make sure that they can prioritize these government contracts and follow those rules.
Okay, thank you, helpful. One other one for Beth. What happens if I don't meet my delivery deadline specified in a DX or DO rated order?
Thanks, Beth. That's a very good question, and it's a question that contractors should take very seriously. If you do not meet the delivery requirements under a DX or DO rated order, typical things would apply when you don't meet delivery, like potential default termination. However, there are substantial potential fines. You could get fined under a criminal liability for up to $10,000 or 1 year in jail if you do not comply and meet the delivery requirements. If there's some extenuating circumstance that you somehow skirted or avoided not complying with that, and you could expose yourself criminally and monetarily.
Okay, thank you. If you're in that position, I strongly urge you to contact the two Beths again, because they're, you know, as you see, there are some huge penalties if you fail to meet delivery deadlines. However, we are in a very highly unusual time, and so you just can't get supplies, or you can't get your people because of some of them have been infected, what have you. So it has been a challenging time, and that is a good question that we have been receiving a lot of questions on. So please reach out to both of us if you're in that position. I do note now that we are past our time. It's already 3:05. And so I want to thank everybody for coming. And if you do have more questions, you can go ahead and email us. You have our emails right there on the sheet, and we'll be sure to get back to you on that. And again, this presentation, including the PowerPoint, will be on the Butzel website, but give us a couple hours to get it on there beforehand. And with that, thank you all. We appreciate it, and we hope that this has been helpful to you. Thank you. And this ends our session.